After the Cold War ended in the late 20th century, the Americans unearthed a terrifying discovery. They had always prided themselves on being capable of taking on the Russian armored hordes with their assumed technological superiority. However, declassified documents and intelligence reports in the 1990s painted a totally different picture, completely shattering those predictions. The findings were shocking, not only because they altered the perceived balance of power, but also because they highlighted significant intelligence gaps. But to understand why their findings were so chilling, we have to go back and start off with the initial perspectives from both sides during the rise of the tensions of the Cold War. Far from just being a political standoff between two clashing ideologies, the decades of riveting events during the 1940s to the early 1990s could be ultimately outlined as a high-stakes arms race between the USA and the Soviet Union. Behind iron curtains and massive walls, boundaries of military technology were pushed by these superpowers to give their war machines the most lethal capabilities and invincibility. It can be said that the battle tank stands at the vanguard of this conflict, being a main offensive weapon in frontline land combat. Battle tanks play crucial roles in providing heavy firepower, strong armor, and mobility on the battlefield. Any technological advancement becomes decisive in securing their place as symbols of military might and strategic superiority. On one side of the competition in tank production is the United States and NATO, armed with superior technology and a focus on combined arms tactics. U.S. tanks were reputed to have excellently integrated operations with the infantry, artillery, and air support. On the other end, the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact were masters of mass mobilization and rapid deployment. Their mass production led to batteries of steel giants in the battlefront that by 1988, the US government estimated the enemy's tanks to be around 52,000 compared to NATO's 20,000. That's a massive difference, and NATO had every right to be worried at those odds. Models like the US M1 Abrams and the Soviet T-72 exemplified the technological rivalry, each designed to dominate the battlefield in its own way. Constantly, these tanks would see modifications, and newer models would also be taking battle stations. Cold War history is loaded with showdowns between US and Soviet tanks, if not direct battles, then by their proxies in Africa, the Middle East, and elsewhere. But in Central Europe, these tanks were hauled to the front lines, ready to strike at the first sign of a hostile act. On the surface, Soviet tanks outnumber their rivals by 2.5 to 1. With sheer numbers, the Soviets could afford to lose some of their force to punch a hole in the US defense and penetrate the front line. However, this numerical comparison does not consider that several Soviet tanks were unavailable for battle in Central Europe. Of the 52,000 Soviet tanks, 17,000 had to be deployed along the Chinese border, and another 5,000 in Central Asia to cope with the areas of instability like Afghanistan and Iran. That leaves around 30,000 tanks on the Central European front versus 20,000 of NATO's.